Good morning and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. And this week, we will have the market, production, and trade updates from our expert Jim Fitzpatrick and have a discussion on the theme where next for the African cashew processing. We will also have a guest joining us today. She is Rousseau Fabres, the product manager of the Galab laboratories in Spain. Also note that the webinar is streamed live on the ACA Facebook page, and the ACA YouTube channel could give you the recording of the past 82 sessions. During the discussion, you can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box right below. Let's take a moment to appreciate our partners and sponsors that are making this webinar possible. The European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. But before inviting Jim, I would like to remind you that we are 146 days to the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, and all roads must lead you to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania from the 18th to the 21st of November this year. Early bird registration ends on August 31st. Now let's come back to Jim. Good morning.
Good morning, Stella. How are you?
Hi, Jim. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
All well, thanks. All very well indeed.
It's been 2 weeks and we couldn't wait to have you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks to ACA. Thanks to all our partners. I also want to say thanks to those of you who are members of the Cashew Club. You can join the Cashew Club. There's nearly 3,000 members now. You can join the Cashew Club on LinkedIn if you're interested. You're very welcome this morning. We're going to talk about things we always talk about. We're going to start off by talking about the markets, and then we're going to have a discussion on African processing. African processing in 10 questions. And the first one is, where next for African cashew processing? And that is becoming a more and more interesting subject as the weeks go on and things change. But let's start with the market and let's have a look at of the trends and some of the recent developments. It still looks a little bit difficult to bullish on the cashews right now, unfortunately. RCN prices have been easing. A lot of this has to do with cash flow and physical availability and product coming to market and the strain that's placing on processors and generally on the sector. And that's putting a little bit of stress on RCN prices. Kernels prices too have been softer lately, but I think that's largely an impact of the strain on the cash flow of many processors. Lower prices, yeah, it looks like the bears have it for now. I'm not saying this market is going to collapse, but I'm saying it's looking maybe a little bit weaker than it has done for a while. What could change that? Well, demand is, there is the prospect of a busy season ahead in India, in Europe, in North America, and later on then in China too. So there are on the horizon reasons to be optimistic in terms of demand, but for now, the market does look a little soft, or as we'd say here, a little bit soft-ish. What about prices? Well, as you're probably aware, raw cashew nut prices have drifted down a little bit. Material has drifted down on a number of factors. In some cases, it's lower quality, such as in the case of Côte d'Ivoire. In others, it's just material coming to market, as in the case of Burkina, Guinea-Bissau, and to a lesser extent, Senegal. So we are seeing prices down anywhere between $20 and $75 down. There are some inventories left in West Africa. If we look at certain countries, Guinea-Bissau, plenty of material, but it's well on its way. It's arrived in the port and it's shipping. If we look at Côte d'Ivoire, there's possibly up to 150,000 tonnes left at the farm level or at the local trader level maybe. And that is going to weigh heavily on the market as the weeks go on. Prices are coming into line though. It's good news for processors, which actually is good news for the market as a whole. When raw cashew nut prices come into line with kernels prices, we then have a logical working market. Prices are aligning with kernels for now. Buyers have time. Processors have some time to make their final moves, but not much. We're now just heading toward the beginning of July. If it takes 3 months to put your purchase together and to get it to your factory, well, that's already September or the end of September. So not much time left to make some decisions from a buyer's point of view. We have some currency fluctuations, and particularly I think the focus on the Indian rupee. If it gets weaker, that makes purchasing decisions a little bit more difficult. India is a huge net importer of cashew nuts, as you know. What about cashew kernels? Well, again, the market, as I mentioned, is a little bit softer, not a lot. I think it's about 5 cents down. You will see some very low prices quoted, but they're from very few processors for very particular positions and often without the kind of quality guarantees that you may want. Buyers do have reasons to wait. They have reasons to wait whilst they see the impact of increased retail prices, the outcome of tariff negotiations, how the crops finish up. They have pretty good cover. Most Western markets, i.e. those markets that buy forward positions, have pretty good cover. They're not in too much of a hurry. In markets where buyers tend to buy shorter positions, markets like China, markets like the Gulf states, important markets, but buyers tend not to buy forward. They also have reason to wait, but of course they don't have forward cover and their actions are determined by on-the-spot demand. Let's have a look at some of the news. Well, there is quite a bit of news this week. In Côte d'Ivoire, the export processing subsidy, which was probably an important foundation of the building of the industry in Côte d'Ivoire, and we're going to talk about processing later, so it is an interesting development, and that's going to be phased out over 4 years. As I understand it, it's 400 CFA, about $720 a ton. It'll go to 3, 2, 1, and then it will be stopped. I also understand that the subsidy for Burma kernels, which was 150 CFA per kilo, that's less than half the full process, that's ending, and it's ending right away. I think that is a really good idea. In Tanzania, Tanzanian crop on the horizon now. September is not that far away. The Cashew Board of Tanzania and the Tanzanian Cashew Processors Association of Cashew Processors, TACP, is working well together toward working out a better, improved procurement system for processors. That's also good news. It's good news for processors, farmers, and buyers of high quality cashew kernels. In Benin, well, we see still, despite the huge development in processing capacity, that processors are still struggling. I read in the week in the ACA Splits, that's the African Cashew Alliance fortnightly market bulletin, well worth reading, that processors are struggling, and one of the reporters in that said that they had only procured about 42,000 tonnes so far this year. That's low. Capacity would be at least 120,000 tonnes. That's a problem. Hopefully that gets addressed soon. In Senegal, a little bit of a pantomime, as my kids might describe it. We had an export tax brought in, we had a protest, we had it reduced, back to business. What's much more interesting this year, I think, is that the cross-border trade between Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, which is of course illegal from the Guinea-Bissau perspective, that's returned. And people are saying between 50 and 70,000 tons has crossed the border. That's telling us two things. It's telling us that the rationalization and the introduction of the rules that were put in place last year to encourage export through the port of Bissau, they seem to have stopped working to a certain extent, although the port is working. At least the intake to the port looks pretty healthy at this time of year. People tell me about 200,000 tons. It also tells us that there is inefficiency in that port to make cross-border trade attractive. And of course, it means that the actions on the border to stop that trade are not as effective as they used to be. And maybe that's no harm in a way, because farmers do need outlets and they need decent prices for their cashew nuts. Anyway, it's happening. We've analysed it here before. We'll probably return to that subject again. China is ending all tariffs on African products. Quite interesting. Certainly China, I guess China strategically is trying to establish an advantage now that the USA has decided to impose tariffs on so many African countries, and quite high tariffs at that. That may open markets in China for African cashew kernels. Demand-wise, looking at the numbers, strong demand in the European Union. Imports are good, sales are good. Very strong imports to China. China is becoming more and more important. About 127,000 tons of a market last year. Steady demand in India, though conflicting reports in India. All is not straightforward in terms of Indian demand for tree nuts right now. But it does look steady, and India will need to buy more raw cashew nuts in the course of the year. On sustainability, I just saw this morning and thought I would include it. There is a proposal now from the European Commission. So this is the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And it was due to come in enforcing companies to take greater responsibility in their supply chain. And that would have knock-on impacts for suppliers of cashew nuts, processors at every level of the chain. There is now a proposal to delay it by 1 year. So that would mean, I think, 2028 rather than 2027. The responsibility now, whereas previously was for the entire chain, is now proposed to be only for your direct partners. So as an importer buyer, let's say a supermarket's buying African cashews, they're responsible for the actions of their partner, the processor that supplies them perhaps, but not further down the chain. And that's fundamental change in this. And the final aspect of the proposed change is that it would apply to companies with more than 1,000 employees only. Previously, that was more than 250 employees. Quite a significant weakening of the proposals. I think it may be driven by the fact that they thought it was placing too much strain on businesses. One article in Snacks magazine, the magazine of the European Snacks Association, suggested that this would take 80% of companies out of this particular measure. Fundamental change, fundamental weakening of that. That does not mean that the idea of making sustainability a central part of your marketing as a processor is lost. It's not. It still remains hugely important. It was never driven by the law. It was driven by consumer demand. Some of the issues around the world then. So in Vietnam, talk about tariffs, waiting for some form of resolution with the United States on the tariff regime. It's 46% is the threat, 10% is the current reality. What will it be? Extended from July? Will it be resolved? There is some disruption to shipping, some port congestion and other issues in Vietnam. But one of the biggest problems is because Vietnamese processors have bought about 900,000 tons from Cambodia, and because prices are higher this year, and because for some, sales are a little bit lower, But don't forget, exports are really, really going well. There are challenges managing cash flow. And that's impacting prices. And that's, I feel, the main driver behind lower prices. Cambodia, well, it's a big crop. It's a much bigger crop than was predicted. So we started talking about a 900,000 ton crop in February. That seemed to be off the agenda from mid-March onwards for 6 to 8 weeks. And it's become clear in recent weeks that it looks like it is at least 900,000 tons this year. Now, whether the Cambodian system is just not good enough to report in good time, or whether there was a little bit of information control going on, we don't know. Fact is, we're back to where we started, around about 900,000 tons, and it could be more than that. In India, a lot of raw nut traders bought high prices, a little bit exuberant in the early part of the season, certainly during the Tanzanian auction until probably the end of February. People were paying prices that you wondered why. And now we unfortunately see that maybe that wasn't such a good idea for them. Demand is picking up. There's a little bit of inventory of tree nuts knocking around in India. Maybe some almonds imported to avoid higher levels of tariff, but they are there. They will be eventually used, managed, solved, consumed. Whether or not that will impact cashew demand remains to be seen. East Africa, Tanzania looks good, looks like a big crop. They're talking 20% higher than last year. I don't think that that's yet anyway researched number, but it wouldn't surprise me. Certainly a good crop coming. It's about inputs, it's about weather, it's about new trees coming online. So expect, as we saw in 2024, expect a bigger crop from Tanzania in 2025. That starts in September. In West Africa, I've mentioned the unsold quantities in Côte d'Ivoire still at the farm gate, which is unusual and means they may not make it to market. They may not have any influence on the actual price or the supply and demand in the end, but they will have an influence eventually, because what often happens is they are left until the new crop comes and they're mixed in. Nigeria appears to be finished in terms of its export activity. They're saying that there's 100,000 tons procured by processors. It seems a little high to me. I hope it's true. It will be great to see Nigeria reach that kind of number for processing. Some of it, of course, may be resold because, as we'll see, many processors are also raw cashew nut traders, and some of them are raw cashew nut traders first and foremost. In Benin, a disappointing situation really. A lot of new processing capacity built. They tell me 42,000 tons only procured by processors. It probably has gone up in the last week or so. That doesn't look great. A lot of materials gone out through neighboring countries for exporters or CN. The ban doesn't appear to work, and it's a very difficult thing to impose when you're looking at land borders. It looks as if this policy needs a little bit of a reboot. In Ghana, disappointing discussion. There's not much cashew processing capacity in Ghana yet, but it does look as if the volume processed this year might be down a little bit. We had very, very high prices early in the season, a lot of market volatility. That sometimes happens in Ghana. And we are looking now to see what the new management at the Tree Crops Development Authority is going to do about it. Will they introduce the regulations that were promised? Will they enforce the ones that exist? We won't really know till next January, February. But for now, it certainly appears that if Ghana is to develop cashew processing, something needs to be done. Western Europe, record imports. Quite remarkable. Would any of us have expected that? Given 30% plus higher prices this year. Buyers are well covered, and maybe they've been bringing in their inventory a little earlier this year. Maybe that's to preserve the quality. They tell me that prices at the retail level have not yet been marked up, at least in major supermarkets, and they will be marked up in July, and we will then see. So a couple of things we need to look at: July, August, September in Europe. We need to look at the impact of increased prices at the retail level. We need to look at the summer. The weather will impact consumption over the summer. And we need to look at the buyer sentiment. So how European buyers might react in a market that's been steady to slowly falling for their cover for the early part of next year remains to be seen. They may have waited. They may find it's time. We may not get an answer to all of those questions in July or even in August. It is a holiday season and many buyers they're around, but they're more reluctant to act at that time of year. So we may have to wait till September to see some kind of action from European buyers. Having said that, prices around the current levels, if good processors were to offer at the current levels that the low processors are at, it looks like good value to me. The US, again, buyers pretty well covered, healthy shipments, soft demand. How do you figure out the tariff situation? Well, that's a bit of a mystery to everyone. I was just reading in other segments, a lot of discussion about who's responsible for the tariffs, who pays them, are they shared, are they pushed back to the origin? How does it work out? Because this was relatively unexpected and contracts were probably written before the tariffs were introduced. So who's responsible? I don't know. Certainly if you're looking at import tariffs of 21% as an example from Côte d'Ivoire, or if it were 46% from Vietnam or 21% from India, if those tariffs were there, that's not sustainable for importers. They do not have margin to deal with that kind of additional cost. And contrary to much of the propaganda, the tariffs are paid at destination and the exporters have zero obligation to cover the cost of tariffs. We will see. So it is quite a calm market at the moment, waiting for news, waiting for activity, waiting for resolution of some of these conflicts. Look out for further falls in RCN in the coming weeks, and I'm drifting down rather than crashing down. And I think kernels will probably consolidate. I think you will get a wide gap between top processors offering high quality product with guarantees on food safety and certified processes compared to smaller processors offering lower quality. I also think that the kernels premium for African cashew processors will be maintained in the coming weeks, even as the market declines. Speaking of processors, let's get into the subject we're going to talk about. Where next for African cashew processing? Let's first of all try and establish where we stand, where we're coming from, before we look at where we're going. So the first question is, how much volume is processed in Africa? And you can see that it is around about 550,000 tons last year, that's RCN, and it's been growing at 16% per annum for the past 10 years. Very strong growth. And if you were to look at 5 years, you'd find that number closer to 21%. Processing, we can truly say, has taken off in African countries. If you look at it, 2024 is 5.5 times the volume processed in 2014. Still not a lot by world standards. Only about 1 in every 10 cashews that's processed in the world is processed in African countries. But that figure was only 1 in 30 back in 2014. So a larger share of a much bigger industry over the last 10 years. How did that come about? Well, let's have a look at some of the major factors. First of all, and this applies in some countries, particularly Côte d'Ivoire, for example, an improved investment environment, security, interest from governments in investment in cashew processing and development of the economies. Mechanization. So mechanization was the game changer. Mechanization meant that if you had the money to invest, you could enter cashew processing relatively quickly. You needed, at that time, maybe 1,000 or 1,500 people. Today, that could be as low as 450, maybe even less. Second factor is access to that technology. And of course, the main suppliers in the last decade have been Vietnamese suppliers, and the Vietnamese suppliers of technology and the Vietnamese government has allowed that technology transfer to take place openly, and people have taken advantage of that. Third factor, particularly in the middle of the last decade, was high kernels prices. We saw booming kernels prices during that period in the middle of the last decade, when prices eventually reached $5.25 per pound for WW320s. That helped to support the development of processing, those 2 years of rising prices. Yes, there was a bit of backtrack in 2018 when prices started to slip back again, but as you can see, the volume continued to grow. Kernels buyers, especially European kernels buyers, became interested in cashew kernels from African countries, and that was driven by their interest in diversified supply, reorganized supply chains, shorter supply chains, sustainable supply chains, and of course, quality cashew products. And the last of the 5 that I would mention, there are others, is government policy, and government policy that became more friendly toward processing, more supportive, and in some cases, directly supportive of cashew processing. So we've seen fast growth. Will it be continued? Big discussion around that, and we're going to come to that. Second question is, where is it sold? Or at least where was it sold in 2024? And 2024 is a little bit different to other years. Biggest market for finished cashew kernels from African countries, and this is the entire continent, is the European Union. 32% were sold within the European Union. The biggest destination was actually not for finished cashew kernels, it was for Burma kernels, the unpeeled kernels, and the biggest destination was Vietnam. And I've calculated 52,000 tons. In truth, it could be more than that. It's just a very difficult number to get to the bottom of. It's very mixed up. It's not distinguished. Sometimes it goes in as RCN, sometimes as kernels. Sometimes it goes in as something else. So what we're seeing is that main markets, European Union, Vietnam, Burma kernels, and into third place, North America, mainly the United States. About 11% of African cashew kernels go there. If we look at the 2 markets that seem logical, because I don't think Burma kernels is at all logical, and I'm glad to see some governments, notably Cote d'Ivoire and Mozambique, beginning to agree with that. Let's look at Europe and the US. And what we see, Europe is the darker of the 2 blues. And you can see a very strong trend into the European market. And that looks like that will continue. Early stage this year, Cote d'Ivoire exports to Europe are up by 43% in the first part of 2025. So this most likely is going to continue into the future. Whereas the United States market, which is much more price sensitive, much less sustainability focused, it's steady enough, and it has been growing, but it's been growing relatively slowly. Let's have a quick look. So in Europe, we see in 2024, a 20% market share. That's pretty spectacular, given where we came from 10 years ago. It's growing at 19% per annum over the last 10 years. Look in the United States, 7% market share, growing at 4%. Not a bad performance, but obviously fades compared to Europe. If we look at markets in West Asia or the Middle East, whichever you prefer to call it, we've got a share now from African cashew processors of about 7%. But it's growing quickly. It's growing at about 21% per annum, and that market is also growing. So growth in a growing market is very positive. The Chinese market I've just singled out because we do now begin to see some penetration from African countries into the Chinese market. 4% market share in 2024. Chinese market's much smaller. It's about half the size of the US market, for example. But it's growing, and it's been growing at 50%. Now that won't continue, not 50%, but it will continue to grow. So what we're looking at is significant penetration into two markets, the European market and the US market, which between them comprise about 35% of world demand. They're the second and third largest markets in the world, and a growing presence in markets in the Middle East and in China. Very positive trends. Maybe a little over-dependent on the European market for now. Third question is, who owns the African cashew processing industry? First of all, which countries is it located in? And first of all, the big factor is 2 of every 3 cashews processed in Africa are processed in Côte d'Ivoire. And if we look, Nigeria, Benin, now we're looking at processing capacity in this pie chart. So it's not actually processed. That's why Benin comes in at 120%. But when we talk about ownership, we talk about factories, we talk about capacity. And if we take the 3 countries, we've got 80% in those 3 countries. African cashew factories are, by and large, big factories, and they're mechanized. So if we look at them by the number of factories, not by the capacity, 71% in Côte d'Ivoire could be described as a bigger factory. That would be 5,000 tons capacity upwards. 35% in Nigeria. Most capacity in Nigeria is large factories, but there are several smaller factories. Benin, 80%, of course, that's mainly Fludor and the Arise project. Ghana is also noticeable, 60% large factories. So significant. Now we look at capacity and we look at who owns the capacity in terms of, are they local companies or are they foreign owned? And again, significant foreign ownership. 74% in Côte d'Ivoire, 82% in Nigeria by capacity, not by number of factories. 50% in Mozambique, though I'm putting an asterisk beside Mozambique because the definition of what's foreign and what's local is a little bit movable there. I also think it's important that we consider the type of owners, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. So I looked at which factories were owned by businesses that are primarily or were primarily raw cashew nut traders, regardless of whether they're national companies or foreign investors. 1/3 of Ivorian factories would have that influence, or that kind of ownership. 50% of the factory capacity in Nigeria. It's also significant in Mozambique. Less so in Ghana and Tanzania, but in both countries, processing is only in its infancy. And Benin, when we look at capacity, we're talking about the 2 names I've mentioned. Neither of them is significant in the raw cashew nut trade. So some conclusions we can draw. African cashew factories are mainly mechanized or semi-mechanized, and they're mainly large scale, mostly above 10,000 tons capacity nowadays. For this exercise, we used 5,000 tons. Secondly, they're more likely to be foreign owned in West Africa than they are in East Africa. And that's probably a trend that will continue. And they are often owned by investors with a background in raw cashew nut trading. So we're looking at a very different structure and of ownership in African cashew processing factories today than in the first, second, or third waves going back to 2014. Impact of this is that mechanization increases the capital expenditure needed. Access to capital expenditure may be limited, therefore it tends to push the investment toward foreign companies, foreign direct investment or partnerships. The larger scale, and we're looking at most of the factories in that area, that increases the the need for working capital or operating capital. And that means that, again, it tends to get skewed toward businesses that can source their working capital at lower interest rates, which often means abroad. As I mentioned, 3 countries account for 80% of the processing capacity, and 2 out of 3 African cashews that are processed in Côte d'Ivoire. Question 4, are the big issues being resolved? What are the big issues and are they being resolved? The first big issue is the processing capacity utilization. So this has been a problem for a long time, that factories are built and they don't get to their processing capacity. And you can see in Benin, in Burkina, the levels are really low. And in smaller processing countries, Togo, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, levels are below 40%. Nowhere is the installed capacity utilized above 85%, which would be a reasonable target for profitable operations. Now you could say, and you would be right, that a lot of these factories are new and we can't expect them to be up to full capacity. That's true. I'd accept that. At the same time, this is an issue. I mean, and I'm not saying that the capacity, and I have not used in this exercise, the capacity claimed by the manufacturer as being the reality. So I take if someone tells me a factory is a 12,000 ton factory, I probably consider it a 10,000 ton factory. I probably then say, what's 85% of that? And I think, okay, a reasonable target is about 8,500 tons. And then I use that. And if we use that, we get maximum utilized capacity in Mozambique at 78%. Tanzania is 70, but bear in mind, it's a very small sector. Only 5% of the crop is processed. And that's the other factor. How much of the crop is processed in the country? And again, we're still, although progress has been made, we're at very low levels of the crop. So capacity, percentage of the crop processed, progress, still a long way to go. I did a little bit of an exercise, and this is about looking at the 4 major processing countries, Mozambique, Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, and compared them to Vietnam, and compared them to Vietnam on a number of factors. The quality of the raw material, post-harvest handling, cost of raw material, available production. So the first 4 areas all about supply. Then supply chain and management and process, linkage to suppliers, availability of labor, availability of qualified managers, and the success of the existing processors. And I'll come to why that's important shortly. And then we looked at brand and reputation, the available infrastructure, and access to working capital. And we just draw a line across it. And I drew the line across at 5 out of 10. So if Vietnam is 10 on all of these factors, these 4 African countries in this scoring system come out mostly below 5. It's not good. Where are they really positive? Quality of raw material, volume of raw material, availability of labor, all positive. Improvement needed in all other areas. So are these issues being resolved? Management of the process, linkage of the supply chain, which is a management issue, linking the supply chain to processors or producers rather. If you want traceability, if you want quality, if you want good post-harvest handling, it's not the job of the government, it's the job of the processor. The processors should link to their suppliers, the producers. Are they doing it? Not enough. Secondly, money. The second M is money, working capital, particularly access to working capital. Look in our 4 countries, compare it to Vietnam, and it's pretty low. It's down there. What's that? 4 out of 10, 40%. Third factor, third M, marketing. Are we seeing long-term customer relationship building? And I don't think we are in many cases. That really needs to be improved. There are some outstanding examples of doing this. And there are some businesses building reputations that will last for many, many decades. But there are others who are selling on today's factors, running it like a bazaar. I have it, I'll sell it, I'll think about tomorrow. So are the big issues being resolved? Nothing's ever clear, is it? Partially, but probably not enough in terms of money, management, and marketing. So what is it that makes processors successful? That's our fifth question. And what has made certain processors successful as opposed to others? And I've split it into two areas. One is about process and supply chain, and the other is about marketing and management. So on the first side, scale. Building the factory to the right scale, making sure that you can be competitive. Selecting the right equipment, and there are choices to be made nowadays. Focusing on a quality product, and I'm talking about quality product on the way in, managing your supply chain, quality product on the way out. Good management, train people who are prepared to train other people. Well-qualified managers know how to work with the raw material and to adjust their process to that raw material, or vice versa occasionally. And good process quality management, good process quality managed systems, and certification. Those are the things that really seem to have worked for those factories that are doing well. We also bring in market factors, so linking to suppliers, good market and customer selection. You know, identifying your competitive advantages, identifying the customers that will appreciate it, and of course, critically, that are prepared to pay for those advantages. If you're making a great quality product, you need to offer it to someone who's prepared to pay for that great quality product. Location, putting the factory in the right place and realizing the advantage that you might have. That distinguishes a successful processor from an unsuccessful processor. A good long-term approach. And what we are seeing increasingly is that processors are defining their brand, telling their story, maybe identifying niche markets. People like Tularo, people like Afukantan, people like Cashew Coast, defining what their brand, what their story is, and where their niche in the market is, makes them successful. You can't really approach processing as you would approach old-fashioned commodity trading. Question 6, well, it's not a nice question. And because we are seeing this, we saw it last year, we're seeing it from big names, we're seeing it from small names, it is causing problems. So I asked the question, how much of a threat are contract defaults? We're talking especially on kernels in this context, obviously an RC, and they also have an impact. When we think about contract defaults, and a default is a renegotiation of a price, of a shipment, of a quality, without the agreement of the buyer, and basically forcing the buyer into something which they do not want, usually due to an increase in market price. We need to recognize that buyers need confidence. So they need confidence to change their sources. 72% of Europeans buy their cashews in Vietnam, or 72% of the cashews imported into Europe are from Vietnam. We would like to change that in favor of African processors. Buyers need confidence to do that. We're asking them to change their sources, change their habits, take a risk. And they doubt that this can be done in Africa, many of them, particularly if you talk to supermarkets. They doubt that African processors can do this. Why do they doubt it? Well, they doubt it because, first of all, it's not been done before. It's relatively new that we would get African cashew processing at this volume. They also doubt it because they have inbuilt prejudices going back to imperialism which they struggle with. That's not surprising. And some of them just don't know. And some of them are just not informed. So can it be done in Africa whilst people are doubting it? When businesses default, renegotiate, or delay, it tends to confirm their worst fears. And that is certainly an issue. So what we're seeing is, with any situation where there's widespread default or renegotiation, unwilling renegotiation, one-sided renegotiation, this does tend to, as they say, damage the brand, and it tends to confirm the worst fears from the fact that some of these people are coming from a situation where they just doubt that it can be done in Africa. And some of them genuinely look at a situation where this is new and hasn't done before, and others, as I mentioned, with inbuilt prejudice, I suppose is the only word we can use, that causes them to doubt the efficiency of agribusiness and cashew processing in particular in Africa. Final point on defaults is all defaults impact everyone. So when you undermine confidence in a sector, buyers tend to have their confidence shaken in all suppliers from that origin, even from that region. So any default impacts everyone, and especially when there's no good, efficient dispute resolution mechanism. So there will always be defaults of contract. How you deal with the problem is really important. If regulators, governments, trade associations, and other members of the same group, other processors, just shrug their shoulders and say, well, why didn't you buy from me? It doesn't really solve the problem. There has to be a dispute resolution mechanism. Default, I'm not saying that there are wholesale defaults from African processors by any means. What I am saying is that there are some, and that there were some, and that there were some from very surprising quarters during last year, and that's done damage, and that needs to be assessed, and it needs to be dealt with in the future. Next question, question 7. Is cashew policy in origin countries helping or hindering development? I think it's probably helping, but I think we need to redefine it a little bit. I think we need to have a look at the way governments regulate and support the development of policy. And I think everyone's got a part to play in that, everyone from ACA to development organizations, to governments, to regulators, to processors. I think we need to consider what type of investor is being sought. Are they long-term? Are they integrated? And there's very few integrated. There's very, very few examples, if any, of businesses that are working all the way through the supply chain. We need a change of business culture in our industry. Secondly, the policy needs to be linked to the market. It needs to be based on good information. It needs to be based on analysis. You may not always agree with what we say on this webinar, but you will recognize that it is an effort to bring a lot of these subjects out into the open and discuss them. And there are others. It needs to be based on linking the supply chain. For me, this is the biggest next step for African cashew processing, is the linkage of processors properly to their supply chain, to the farmers, to the post-harvest, and build a supply chain linkage that financial institutions can understand. They can understand the risk, they can understand how it works. And the best way to do that is good communication between processors and direct linkage to organized farmers. Government policy should focus more on organizing farmers that processors can work with. And it should be real. It's not just about talking the game, it's about actually doing it. I think that policy generally should reduce the restrictions. And why do I say that? Because I think that restrictions on borders simply don't work. A policy that doesn't work, a regulation that doesn't work, undermines confidence in the sector. And we've just been talking about buyers' confidence. So if you see a ban on exports, if you see regulation on exports of raw cashew nuts cross-border, and meantime the product goes across in vast quantities, that doesn't achieve its aim and certainly undermines confidence. So I think that focusing on supports would be a better way forward. There may be aspects of enforcement that are needed, but it would be better to make that export, illegal export, unnecessary in the first place by supporting the domestic industry. And finally, realistic goals. Realistic goals are really important aspect of policy because they build confidence, they build morale, they build the way the sector works. So if we look at where we're going, where is the African cashew processing business going? It should be going in these directions. It should be integrated investors, linking policy to the markets, linked to market realities, building linkages to suppliers. It must be long-term and it must be realistic in terms of its objectives, and policy should reflect that. So yeah, I think policy is helping the development of processing, but there are certain measures that are hindering it, and those should be really seriously looked at and perhaps reformed. We've got a lot of development organizations, we've got a lot of trade associations, we've got a lot of regulators. How can they help? Can they help? Well, what I'd like to see is I'd like to see those organizations focus on the things that they are good at. Focus on building sector organization and trust in the chain. Building supply chain access at the farm gate. So that means helping to create farmer associations. Building farmers to the point where they're regarded as the businesses that they are, and helping them to organize so that they can realize their strength in the supply chain. Development organizations and regulators should try to influence policy so that it's linked to the realities of the market, not just the realities of politics, but also the realities of the market to facilitate development of processing. They should help access to finance, and they should support technical assistance. Increasingly, we see development organizations talk about marketing and markets. Unfortunately, they're not very good at that. That's not what they were created to do. But they are very good at building supply chains, supporting supply chains, improving access to technology or finance, and at influencing policy. And that's where they should focus. When I see development organizations and regulators trying to help processors sell, I worry, because I feel they're not really qualified to do that. And when I look at some of the exhibitors at trade fairs, particularly in Europe, I've seen Anuga, Cial, and so on. I'm looking and I'm wondering what is going on here. The ill-equipped processor brought to the wrong trade fair to talk to the wrong people just doesn't build confidence. It just says, hey everyone, we don't know what we're doing here. So that really needs to be looked at. So marketing and market development is a very key factor, but it has to really be done by the processor, and give them the tools, is what I'm saying. Question 8, what can make, or what will make, because I believe it will happen, what will make African cashew processing competitive? And some of it already is. First of all, focus on the competitive advantages. Use the advantages of better quality product. Right now, the best exportable in volume cashew kernels in the world are available in African countries. India's essentially off the export market for cashew kernels. For now, the quality from Vietnam is lower than it was. In Vietnam, it's about price. Second competitive advantage, location. Third one is traceability. You can be linked to the farm. You can offer traceable, quality controlled product from the farm gate, something which is difficult to do for processors in India, 69% of the raw materials imported, and in Vietnam, 89% of the raw material imported, 60% from Africa. Very difficult to offer traceability. And finally, and on the same topic, it's sustainable, a sustainable product, a high quality, well located, traceable, well linked to farmers, adds up to a sustainable product. And within that context, African cashew processors are competitive. And the evidence is, in the last 3 years, that buyers, or some of them at least, are prepared to pay for that. Second factor is, how can we get to be cost competitive? And it is important, and it is possible. And what we're seeing is, we're seeing a little bit of a leveling of the playing field in one sense, because the introduction of mechanization, and I'd ask you to focus on the black bars. So this across a number of countries. On the right-hand side, we have Vietnam, processing African RCN or Cambodian, and Indian modern factories processing primarily for their domestic market. And what we see is that when Vietnamese factories or Indian factories are processing African raw cashew nuts, African factories are pretty close, and in some cases, more competitive. And these are general figures. There are cases of competitive, cost competitive factories. I wouldn't put those up in public, obviously, but they do exist, and there are several of them. And looking at this, you can see that the higher cost of assembly of the raw material, African raw material going to Vietnam, African raw material going to India, because of freight rates, because of export taxes, because of the cost of assembling, financing, insuring, and managing that raw material, it's not cheap. So you have an advantage in the supply chain if you're located at origin, but you may have additional costs, and you have extra costs because of the cost of utilities, the cost of startup, perhaps in the early years, lower productivity in certain sections of your process, and you may have generally higher costs of doing business in African countries than in Vietnam, for example. Think back to what we were saying a few minutes ago when we assessed the advantages, disadvantages of the major African processing countries compared to Vietnam. But it is possible, and it does exist already. The next step is for that to happen right across the countries. Where's the watershed? Something like $400 a ton for processing. Somewhere in that region is about right for competitiveness if your supply chain costs are competitive. Many people are achieving that. Not all. That's the next thing to work on. And it is possible. How do I know it's possible? Because it's already been done. Third factor that'll make African cashew processing competitive is good marketing. And that's, I think, in 2 areas. First of all, selecting the right customer. If you have a high quality product that's sustainable and traceable, you need a customer that values a high quality product that's sustainable and traceable. If they just want the price, maybe they're not your customer. Picking the right customer is important. Second factor is the ability to meet the buyer's requirements, and that ranges anywhere from the specification of the product through to the process certification, through to the documents, type of communication, shipping, contract terms, the whole range of factors, and they do change from buyer to buyer. So picking the right market and the right customer in that market is really important. It's not just about selling, it's about selling to the right customer. As that happens, and I think there are signs that it is happening, as that happens, processors will become more competitive. And finally, regulation. We've talked about policy, we've talked about development agencies. Effective regulation is important, and I break that up into 4 areas. First of all, support for infrastructure, particularly the post-harvest infrastructure. That the infrastructure is there to manage situations where the climate and the weather are less predictable, situations in which the product may well rest in the country of origin, longer. It may well take longer for processors or exporters to buy that product. You need infrastructure, warehousing, drying yards, availability of the right kind of bags to store the product. Secondly, linkage to farmers. That means organizing farmers. Very difficult to go out and buy from 500 individual farmers, but put those in 3 farmer groups or 4 farmer groups or 5 farmer groups, and you've got something to work with as a processor. Regulation policy can help that. Thirdly, it should be market-based. So it should focus on the realities of the market. Which market is closer? Which market likes which products? How do they buy? What's important for them? Is traceability important? Is sustainability important? Or is it just price? Which are the factors that are important? And the policy and the regulation should help that. And the final one is long-term, realistic objectives. And I say that because if you look at the science, if you look at the commentary over many years from many analysts on policy and regulation, not just in cashews, what you see is that making unrealistic or overly optimistic objectives tends to undermine policy, tends to undermine regulation, tends to undermine trust, and certainly undermines the confidence of the sector going forward. So effective regulation. So 4 big areas. Using the competitive advantages, they exist, that's a choice. Becoming cost competitive, that's about good management and organization. Effective marketing, that's about picking the right people, training them, preparing, and storytelling. And effective regulation is, again, it's a choice. It's a choice to be market-oriented, to be infrastructure and producer-oriented, so that processing can thrive. I think these 4 areas are being worked on. I think that they are the future, and I think they will make African cashew processing competitive in every aspect. And we know this is true because for some, it's already happening. So the 10th question, final question, what's next for African cashew processing? And let me remind you, this is an individual point of view. It's not the point of view of the African Cashew Alliance, though they may agree with me. I hope they do. I think what's going to happen next is that we're going to see something of a rationalization. We've seen very fast growth, 20% per annum over the last 5 years. Now we'll see the rationalization. This will be encouraged by, in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, by the reduction and eventual removal of the subsidies. So some of the businesses that were subsidy reliant may well change hands, may well close down, may well restructure their business. That will happen. Other part of rationalization, I think, is that we will see a greater geographical spread of processing. We've seen concentration in Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and in Benin, primarily due to one project in Benin. We'll see a wider spread. Now we'll see, in my view, we'll see more processing springing up in Ghana, in Tanzania. We'll see a reboot in Mozambique, and that seems to be already happening. And I think we will see more capacity in a wider range of countries. And certainly that would be healthy. That doesn't mean to say that processing will not continue to grow in those countries that are already well established. I think it will, but that the emphasis will change. We'll see a little bit slower growth, but we'll see better growth, hopefully learning from the lessons of the past. We're telling what is, or we're observing what is a very positive story. But we worry, I worry. We've seen, in my time, we've seen 3 waves of African cashew processing that have come. 2 of them have gone, for good reason. So you do tend to worry about the next steps. And before my time, there was another wave of processing which was very successful in its day, but the world changed. Third factor, I think, is we're going to see much greater linkage between the processors and the supply chain. I don't think it is financially, economically, socially, or environmentally sustainable to simply be buying from traders. Unless, of course, you're a trader yourself, and that's your mindset. I don't think that is sustainable as an approach, as the culture of the industry. So I think less speculation is likely. We'll see the end of the trader processor. Choices will be made. They will either be traders or they will be processors. One or the other, one way or the other. That's the next step. I think that is almost certainly going to happen. And I think we will see also more focus on value, more focus on value addition and value creation. So for example, the end of Burma kernel trade, perhaps not the end of it, but a reduction in the Burma kernel trade, better utilization of byproducts. We're seeing moves in that direction already. And in some cases, the more advanced cases, the introduction of secondary processing, perhaps packed cashews, perhaps roasted cashews for export. In the long term, the ideal situation would be that all processing, the full process, is done in the country of origin and the product is shipped directly to the distributor or to the supermarket. So rationalization, slower growth, focused on better growth, on quality growth, linked to the supply chain with less speculation, more dedicated, integrated processing units, and greater levels of value addition. That's what I think is next. And I think that's happening. And I think it will happen in the next 10 years. So I would see continued growth, perhaps a little bit slower, but of a different sort and better. Before that happens, and that's the hard part, is in the next couple of years, you're going to see some rationalization in processing in certain countries, in my view. So that is what I think are 10 important questions to ask about the African cashew processing sector. And I've tried to give you some ideas of not only my answers, but answers that I've collected from a number of people over the last few weeks. So thanks very much for that. Let me go back to Stella and see if there are any questions on any of these topics. Stella.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, I would like to start with a comment. Indeed, as ACA, we do agree with you on question 10, and we are expecting strong supply linkages as a way of addressing the upcoming EU requirements.
Well, that's a nice positive comment.
And our first question, can you clarify a bit? Are you saying that foreign raw cashew nut traders are those who diversified their business to process in West Africa?
Well, what does diversify mean? I'll just put it like this. Some businesses are processors that do a little bit of trading. Some businesses are processors. And some businesses are traders with a
ou
little
alors
on the side.
certaines entreprises
That's what I'm
interviennent dans la distribution pendant que d'autres interviennent dans la transformation. Et c'est tout cela qui
We seem to have a little technical issue there with the translation coming through on the same channel. Ah, it's gone. Okay.
Yes. Yes, it's been solved, Jim.
So I hear. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Yes, we have another one for you. What is the likely trend in the future? More locally owned processing factories or more foreign owned? And how does that matter?
Who actually owns the factories probably doesn't really matter. You would like to think that more locally owned factories, because obviously locally owned factories are more likely to stay in business in the long term and more likely to weather through crisis. What do I think will happen? I think there will be more partnerships
je crois qu'il va y avoir beaucoup plus de partenariats.
and international businesses. I think that there will be more investment from outside the sector. So there'll be more investment from development funds, more investment eventually, and it's what's lacking is from the buyers of kernels. There's very few that have invested in processing. So the level of local ownership of processing will go up, but it probably will be supported by international partners. But those partners may be more diversified than they have been in the past. I think that
Ils ne l'ont été depuis le passé.
a situation where you get more international financial institutions engaged, there definitely is a taste for that at the moment. And what they need is local partners. So therefore the local ownership would increase. Will we see local businesses, small businesses or large businesses set up cashew processing factories? It's possible. I think we may see some larger businesses diversify their own interests into cashew processing. But I think the demands of capital expenditure for a modern cashew factory are so high now that for small local entrepreneurs, SMEs, to do that without partnership is very difficult. Stella.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think at this point we are going to welcome our guest and get back to you.
Very good indeed. Thank you, Stella.
Hi, Rose. Good morning.
Hello. I hope you can hear me. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
It's a pleasure for us to have you today, and we'll let you have the floor, and we'll be back with comments and questions from the participants.
Oh, thank you so much for giving me the turn. So I would like to introduce myself before I start doing a brief presentation about who I am and who we are in my organization. I am a product manager in the company Galab Laboratories Spain, and I was invited to conduct a brief webinar in this meeting to first of all introduce us, and then show a little bit, present a small bit of how is the food regulated in the European Union, which is very much in line to the presentation that Jim conducted today, and I believe it will be of interest to you as producers of cashews. So I will follow by sharing my screen in the next seconds, and if you have any problems, if you cannot see it, please let me know. So I hope you can see by now my screen. It's
Yes, we
not
can
least.
see.
Okay. So yeah, as I said in this presentation, I will first start by introducing who we are, and then I will follow by, well, talking about food law, and then with this open question of why is food law important? Why do we need it, and which are the motives behind it? Then I will follow by explaining a bit the basics of the principal EU food regulations. And then I will subsequently continue by showing some example cases of that might be of interest for cashew producers. So first of all, who we are. Well, we are a laboratory. We offer food testing analysis, but also product testing services. We are accredited, which is very important to certify analysis and also for exporters in not only in Europe but in the rest of the world. And we operate through different subsidiaries in different countries, such as Turkey, Southeast Asia, and Spain. We are in Spain, so we are a commercial office of this laboratory. And in Spain, we do the consultancy support and everything that has to do with supporting our customers, not only in Spain, but also in Africa. So we do support in all African countries. And besides that, we also have local representatives based in Benin and also in South Africa, where we also have more technical offices. We are currently growing, and that's why we found interesting to present us in this webinar, as it's a great opportunity to connect with more of you. So having shown a little bit of who we are, and this is a small picture of one of the insights of our laboratories in Germany, I will continue by introducing a bit the topic of today. So here's the big question: why is food law important? Well, food law is it's key to ensure not only the safety of the products, but also the traceability and transparency of the food chain. So the European food law has many objectives, and we could summarize them, or the key points could be the protection of the public health. We all want safe food, hygienic and free of toxic substances. So we all want to make sure that what we eat is safe. We also want to protect consumer interests, not only by protecting their health, but also by providing them the information they need to make sure they know what they are buying, which are their interests, that the labels they can read in the supermarkets are reliable, etc. Additionally, food law is important because it can facilitate fair trade within Europe and the rest of the world. By establishing defined rules of production, we make sure that every product across Europe has the minimum same standards, which creates this guarantee that all products comply with the same rules. Additionally, food law prevents food fraud and also misleading information. So we make sure that we are all participating in a fair trade, that we are all playing with the same rules, and therefore it provides legal basis for inspections, recalls, and penalties for the ones that are not following the rules. Well, so to put this into the ground and to actually make this a little bit more easy to follow, we could say that the aspects of food law are multiple, are very diverse, and I structure it as a tree in which the basis of the tree, so the root of it, is the regulation number 178 from 2002. This is the basic regulation, and on top of it, many aspects have been regulated afterwards. One of these aspects, including in food law, are the hygiene and controls of food. We, as mentioned, hygienic and secure food is very important. But also another aspect could be the information to customers. This is another aspect which has another whole block of sub-regulation regarding details about how labels look like, which is allowed to be claimed in a product, what's forbidden. Another aspect is the food safety. How is safety regulated in food? Which contaminants are not allowed? What are the levels of pesticides allowed, etc. Another of the aspects is the quality of products. This comprises a set of rules of which are the minimum quality standards, not only for cashews, but for the diversity of food products we find in supermarkets. So this could be the basic structure of this presentation, and then I would start with the basic regulation on the bottom of the tree, which is the basic EU law defining the whole rest of food law in Europe. Well, this regulation was promoted because of several factors that led to the existence of this regulation. This came followed as different crises that happened in Europe before the year 2000, such as the dioxin crisis, where food was contaminated, and therefore there was the importance to create a new framework for the protection of the public health. So the European Commission made this regulation defining this framework for the safety legislation with the key objectives mentioned before. So health, ensuring health, public health, protecting consumer interests, taking into account also animal health, plant health, and the environment. So not only food itself, but also the whole surrounding of it. And with also a special interest on facilitating the free movement and trade within the EU. So which are the key points in this regulation? We could summarize, or we could extract some of the key factors that are basic in this regulation. One of them is the mention to the operators, as they are primarily responsible to make sure that the food is safe. So operators must implement monitoring procedures. They must make sure they are aware of the law and that their products are safe and comply with not only the main regulation, but all the subsequent rules. So this is highlighted in this regulation. Important also that the traceability is kept throughout the food chain. In its Article 18, traceability is mentioned, and it is essential that a product can be traced from the beginning to the end. So this is the principle from farm to fork. All products have to be able to be traced. So with a series of lot numbers and charge numbers, everything must be controlled and documented properly in order to prevent food scandals or to be able to control the process. More key points are the fact that consumers have the right to accurate information. They must be informed about composition, origin, and much more details about the food they are consuming. Another important point is the risk analysis principle. After the creation of this regulation, there is the creation of the body, the European Food Safety Authority. This body in the European Union serves as the responsible for scientific assessment. This is an independent body that comprised by scientists and experts in the matter who are constantly collecting scientific evidence to be up to date about new risks, informing the European Commission in order to make decisions. So this committee of experts have the task to be aware of the latest science and therefore keep the European Union at the latest state of the art to prevent or to protect the public health. After and one of the last key points that I would like to mention is the reinforcement of the rapid alert system for food and feed, so-called RASF. This is an exchange platform, an information platform between food safety authorities of the different member states of the EU, which serves as an exchange platform. So whenever there is a new scandal, a new alert, authorities are informed right away. This is a public accessible search window where everyone can check from every user can have access to it, and we can search for cashews, for origin, and by many different features. So as a producers, this can be very informative to be updated of which are actually the current dangers, the current risks in your product in particular, and depending on the origin as well. Having talked about this basic regulation which defines the framework for the others, we can talk about hygiene and controls. Controls and hygiene are or cover multiple aspects, such as hygiene, which is covered in the regulation number 852 from 2004. There are also more regulations on official controls, border controls, and controls by the authorities in Europe. And we can talk about other relevant certifications. Even though having the BRC IFS certification is not, it's not mandatory according to the law, it might be that certain importers require you to have such. So it's important to be aware of their existence and also of their updates. We will talk here just in detail about the hygiene regulation. This regulation came after the main food law regulation, which laid down rules for food business operators, taking into account the principles of food safety, the importance of the hazard analysis and critical control points. This is mandatory for every operator, for every company to have this system. So also Also, importers must meet their requirements. Every company must have this system, so it's important to know which are the processes and analyze all the steps that might be a critical control point, and there to have a proper monitoring system. So this is very important, and this is regulated in this regulation. All the details can be consulted in the official document, but it was one of the biggest concerns or biggest points to regulate in terms of food law. There are also official documents made by companies or by organizations to support producers to conduct them throughout the process of creating their own HACCP and subsequent documentation. But also private laboratories or consultants can assist you, including our organization. So another of the aspects of this stream is the food information to customers. This includes the aspects of the food labeling. How can food be labeled in Europe, which can be included, which is forbidden? What should be included in the nutritional label? This is the case of how do we inform the customer how much fat a product has, calories, etc. Which claims can be written in a product? Health and nutritional claims. Health claims are strictly regulated, so not everything is allowed. Not every claim referred to an improvement of the human health can be written in a product. We have to make sure that they comply with certain rules, which are very strict, often supported by laboratory testing. And also an important mention to special groups. In this case of the cashews, it's not often the case, but for example, baby food or special dietary groups might also have their own particular legislation regarding food information to customers. We will talk about the main food labeling regulation here. So the regulation number 1169 from 2011 sets rules for labeling and information to customers. And besides this main regulation, which is the framework for all the, let's say, for the generalities of what can be put in a food product, there is strict control on health and nutrition claims. And to name some examples of what is allowed in cashews is, for example, the mention of high in magnesium. This we can see often in cashews, labeled because the levels of magnesium are enough. So you have to really measure these levels and control and compare to what's allowed according to the regulation. Source of phosphorus is often indicated in other cashews. So this might be varied, and it's encouraged to support by analysis and by assessment of laboratories. But this, of course, can improve the marketing strategy of your product. Another aspect of this tree, we would discuss about the food safety. This is the key aspect. This makes sure that the products we eat will not harm our health. And therefore, multiple aspects are also included in the food safety. The additives that are included in food products, but also the levels of residues detected in these products. So how are pesticides regulated, or veterinary drugs in the case of meat products, but also contaminants. Some metals can be toxic, so we have to control if the levels are okay in the products we consume. Moshmoa is also a topic of interest currently, and in cashews it's also very relevant. But also microbiological criteria. It's important to make sure that the products we eat are not contaminated by bacteria that might harm us. And also food contact materials. So the plastics that are in contact with food products should not transfer any harmful substance to the food itself. And much more is included in this food safety bubble, and it's of course being updated every day with new scientific evidence. In this presentation, I would I would like to focus on pesticides because, well, pesticides is a well-known topic, and to discuss a bit where are pesticides regulated, we go to the regulation number 396 from 2005. In this regulation, the maximum residual levels of pesticides are included in so for every kind of product of plant origin and animal origin, pesticide residues are defined. This regulation includes all these levels, maximum levels, depending on the product. And these levels are not set arbitrarily. These levels are set after a long assessment of these pesticides properties and so on. And they are they apply also to imported products, of course. And they are set after the EFSA's risk assessment opinions are considered here. So this body that we talked before about, the European Food Safety Authority, has a big importance in the decision process of which levels are allowed in certain products and for certain pesticides, which very much depends on the kind of crop and of the potential toxic properties of certain plant protection products. So of course, farmers, traders, and importers are responsible for complying with these limits. And an important mention is that when a pesticide is not specifically mentioned in this regulation, then a default maximum level of 0.01 milligrams per kilogram applies to the product. This ensures that in case of that there's not enough evidence, we are still protected. So one of the key aspects is to protect the population when information is not on the table. So this is a very important detail to consider. Well, for the producers, it might be complicated to know which levels of pesticides are allowed in their products. So the European Commission created a database allowing users to search for last maximum limits for different products. Under this link, or you can, after an easy search in Google, you can come up to the pesticide database. And in this database, different products, in this case, I put an example of cashew nuts, different products can be searched. So it's a very user-friendly mask in which cashews can be searched. And then you can search by the pesticide residue of interest. In this case, I wrote glyphosate. And then the maximum level is displayed. This is updated with the last legislative news, so it's always updated, and it's a very friendly tool to use for producers, which I recommend to take a look. And well, discussing the last aspect of mentioned in this presentation would be the quality of food. Quality of food includes different aspects as well. So quality of products is defined by different guides and product specifications, not necessarily always defined by the European law, but also by exporters, distributors, etc. So it's important to be aware of their existence. Also, organic production and farming might increase the quality of your product. So depending on the market you are addressing to, the interest in organic production is increasing. So different regulations also support the whole set of rules for organic production, in which I will not focus in this presentation, but we can, or it can be discussed in the future. And also the geographic indication might be another indication of quality in your products. So about guides and product specifications, different parameters or different guidelines exist for cashew nuts. It always depends on your customer interest. But to mention some, importers might refer to quality characteristics such as the Association of Food Industries, in which quality parameters for cashews are defined, differing from first, second, or third quality, depending on the type of cashews present. Parameters such as color, size, or impurities might be an indicator of this classification of quality. But these guidelines also often indicate different technical requirements, such as maximum limits of contaminants or limits of microbiological agents. So it's not only an indication of quality, but it can serve you as a guide to know more of the technicalities of your product, and it can be a really good tool to give to provide a first overview of the rules you should follow. And there are also other standards, such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, which also defines another or different set of parameters to differ between different qualities of your cashews. So, for example, the color or the number of stained kernels is also considered here. So this might be also good guidance to be able to classify, to know in which quality could your cashews be classified, and also in very much in connection to what Jim mentioned before. Quality is an important parameter, and to be aware of the guidelines that exist currently might give you an advantage in the market. So finishing, now we covered a little bit this schema of the tree of food law that I try to depict in this schema. And even though we didn't go into detail to every sort of aspect in food law, I try to give an example in every case. So this is to conclude, I would like to say that food law is a very broad term. It includes many more aspects than what I mentioned today, but I hope that this gave brief introduction and an idea of how food law is structured in the EU. And of course, we thank you for your attendance, and we are open to questions, inquiries. You can contact me per email or us if you have analytical questions, or if you need assessment in food law, etc. We are there to support you. So thank you very much. And I think I will pass the word to Stella again. Maybe if we have questions in the chat.
Yes, proceed. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I have a question pending here for you. Could you please go over again the quality of products for importers?
Yeah, so the quality parameters defined by importers might differ between the, let's say, the wishes of the importer. So it's there are some minimum quality parameters to follow, but depending on the market they are addressing, they might be more or less strict, or they might require importers or producers to comply with certain specifications or with certain quality standards. So this very much depends on the market they are addressing.
Thank you. Another question, going back to your slide on pesticides, could you please detail a little bit on the risk assessment process?
Mm-hmm. So this risk assessment process is conducted by the European Food Safety Authority. They are in charge of emitting scientific reports, so they collect data on toxicity. They also consider the exposure to the chemicals, to the population, and potential risks, and then they conduct their scientific tests, and they collect data from different sources, and then they inform the European Commission, and they are the ones that decide which levels they are applying to different products. So, but the risk assessment is conducted by this independent authority, which has the only purpose of providing scientific information.
Thank you very much, Jose. We have exhausted the questions we had for you. It was a pleasure having you today. Let's go back to Jim. Hi, Jim.
Okay.
Hey, Stella.
Jim, tell us what should be the outlook for the next year?
Well, I think that we're looking probably at a relatively calm couple of weeks ahead. Buyers of raw cashew nuts are likely to remain relatively calm, some of them because they don't have the money or the sales. But generally speaking, they've got to keep an eye on the calendar because time is running out. The logistics and cash flow pressures are building a little bit. So I think we can expect raw cashew nut prices to be a little bit weaker in the coming weeks. Having said that, a lot of the better quality material is going to be difficult as time goes on. So buyers conscious of quality might want to make a move now in Guinea-Bissau, for example. We should remember that the Southern Hemisphere crops are, believe it or not, less than 3 months away now. And that we will get, I mentioned earlier, a likelihood of a good crop from Tanzania. That will come to the international market by the end of October. It will come to processors, hopefully in September, something to bear in mind. It will be interesting to see. So July is quite a big month. A lot of events in July, unusually. We'll see new retail prices in supermarkets. We may get an idea of the reaction to that. It might take a little bit longer. We may see an extension of the current US tariff situation, which would mean 10% for Vietnam, or we may see a settlement. And I know there has been a lot of discussions with the officials in Vietnam, between the officials in Vietnam and their US counterparts. If we get a resolution on the tariff headings, I think it's quite likely that we will see a little spike in buying interest on kernels. I don't expect that to be a big wave of buying, but it may well encourage people to top up a little bit, and it might bring a few American buyers to market. So I'm not saying it's going to be a very busy few weeks, but it is going to be interesting, and particularly with the focus on the resolution of some of these trade issues. So the next time, in 2 weeks, when we come back to talk cashews again together, we're going to focus on the impact of tariffs. We're going to focus on demand, and we'll review the demand trends over the first half of 2025 and where that might lead us in the second half of the year. So we'll see some of the trends on quantity, volume, price. We might even look at some of the trends on buyers' requirements related to quality and related to the kind of things that Rosa has been talking to us about in the last 30 minutes. Thanks very much for everyone for joining today. It's always a pleasure. You can contact me. Maybe I'll just put up my contacts onto the screen as usual. Feel free to contact me. I'm always interested to talk about cashews. And it looks like my power is not obliging at the moment. Here it goes. And don't forget, you can see all of the videos of all of the 83 now ACA GME with Jim events on the YouTube channel. And if you want cashews, feel free to talk to me, and we'll be back together on the 6th of July. Thank you very much, Stella. Thank you very much, Rosa. Thanks, everyone. See you. Bye-bye.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much for the 83rd Global Markets Encounter. Thank you very much, Jose, for joining us today.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and good luck with the next global markets. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
And I would also want to thank our partners and sponsors who made this webinar possible: the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. As Jim mentioned, all Global Market Encounter sessions with Jim Fitzpatrick are available on the ACA YouTube channel at African Cashew A, where you can watch 83 recordings anytime. Also, mark your calendars. The 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is taking place from November 18th to 21st of this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Register now and enjoy 40% off all conference rates. Until next 2 weeks, enjoy the networking session.